Hi, everyone, and welcome back to a brand new episode of Say Again with me, Amrita Tripathi. I'm beyond delighted to have on today the very wonderful, very accomplished Suhasini Haidar, the diplomatic editor of The Hindu, who writes on foreign policy issues. Suhasini also hosts a weekly online show, Worldview, with Suhasini Haidar. And she was a foreign affairs editor and primetime anchor prior to this, which is where our journeys overlapped. Suhasini, thank you so much for taking out the time in a very, very busy season.
Right. Well, Amrita, it's always a pleasure to chat with you. And I don't know about all the very veries that you just said about me. All I can say is that I enjoy what I do just like you do.
I want to talk to you about journalism and all of the things that have changed, and I'm going to keep an eye on the clock so we stay within the stipulated time. But Suhasini, to start with, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you think has been your most impactful work. I know we're covering almost 3 decades of a reporting career, but professionally, personally, when you look back at your journey so far, what do you consider to be the thing that had the most impact?
Well, Amrita, everybody sees journalism differently. There are those, unfortunately, today who see it as some kind of a product which is meant to grab eyeballs and grab viewers and listeners and influence people and all the rest. And I kind of see journalism as a window. It's a service we provide where we open the window for anyone who's wanting to listen or hear or see for themselves what's happening on a certain issue. And of course, there are so many issues and so many opinions, and many of those opinions are just pre-programmed without actually knowing about what's happening on the ground. So if I were to talk about my work, I would say what I really pride myself have on having done on many issues is really open that window, let people see there is another side. Particularly, and this is where my real interest comes in India's neighborhood. And these are places where it's always amazing to me that even though they're right there, they're touching distance from India. Whether it is the countries like Sri Lanka, Nepal, Maldives, which of course are great tourism destinations, but are not actually destinations for Indians to go and understand how these places work. Or the more difficult, challenging countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, or the more remote like Bhutan. I've always felt that that's where I've been able to get that little extra amount of insight, if you like. Because I do think it's important for Indians to understand their region a lot better, to understand what kind of a place we live in. Every kid grows up these days in cities and in talking about being able to access places like Dubai or Singapore or further west or further east. But what about what's right here? So if there's something I really have enjoyed doing and I think I could have made the most impact in, it's that understanding of the region.
That's incredible. I do want to ask you a little bit, of course, about your domain expertise. And there's so many complicated things happening in the world, which would be require a masterclass, I think, episode by episode. But first, let me unpack a little bit of what you said. When you got into journalism versus now in 2024, coming to the end of 24, do you feel like it's getting more and more complicated to be a good journalist, to be an unbiased journalist? We seem to be in this era where there's a huge trust deficit globally when you look at some of these studies and surveys in the media. We of course have misinfo, disinfo, and we're in this era where my facts and your facts apparently may not align. Do you think that impartial news gathering and news and reporting is getting more and more complicated to do?
Definitely. And, I'm talking now 30 years ago, which is when I joined the profession. This year actually marks 30 years. And I had gone to the United States to study TV journalism, broadcast journalism, as it was known, because it was both TV and radio. And simply because, believe it or not, at that time, it wasn't really being taught in India. And it was, maybe there were journalism schools, but it wasn't really, there wasn't so much known about television journalism. We were just moving into the private era of television news, really. And I remember when I came back from the United States, I started working for CNN in the US, and then I came back and I got a job with them in India. And I remember when I came back, there was all this excitement about television news because, News Track and NDTV were showing new things that people didn't expect ever to be able to see beyond the state television that they had been used to. And there was a certain glamour attached to it. Everybody really wanted, they'd stop you on the streets and if you were recording something and say, how can my child get into journalism and that sort of thing? And there was a certain sense that, journalists were doing something very, very brave and different, and it was something to be proud of. Unfortunately, what's happened in these 30 years is many of our own journalists, and the fact is journalism hasn't acquitted itself in India as it should have. A lot of it has been devalued simply because of what I said at the beginning, which is this idea that news is a product, in which case you need to find the maximum market for that product. If you see news as a service instead, it may be a little more stodgy, it may be a bit more boring, but at the end of the day, you're not in that race for sticky eyeballs and for the number of clicks and the number of hits and that sort of thing. And so part of the devaluing of journalism has become because of the corporatization, the productization of it, if you like, the commercialization of it. Some of it has also become because governments have become increasingly more authoritarian, not just in India, of course, but around the world. But this idea that has come because maybe of social media, where leaders really think, why do I actually need journalists? I can deal directly with the people. I can get on a social media account and speak directly. I don't need someone to filter me. I don't need someone to question me. And increasingly, I find journalists who are okay with that idea, but essentially talking us out of a job. Now, at the
Hmm.
end of the day, the person who really suffers is the reader, the viewer, the listener, who is the taxpayer or who is the citizen of a country, because they're no longer they're just getting single way access. The government wants to put out a version, and that's the only version that will get put out or will increasingly be amplified. Today, the government reaches out to influencers, for example. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Those are really interesting shows. Those are really important shows that our ministers go on. But at the end of the day, they're not going to domain experts in the same way and getting questioned or getting their toes put to the fire as journalists are supposed to do. So, in a sense, we have some of it has been because of journalism itself, some of it has been because of the people who own media organizations, and some of it has been really because of the way governments and people in authority now look at journalists.
Yeah.
Finally, I will say actually that it is the best time to be a journalist. And you might think that that's a very contradictory thing to say, but actually, this is when journalism is tested. If you can continue to be unbiased, get the facts, try and write stories or record stories or put out news that is actually getting a 360-degree view, it's probably going to be better than the kind of journalism you even did 30 years ago, where you didn't
Hmm.
need to be so careful, where there wasn't a social media out there waiting to fact check you on every line and seeing if you got something wrong. So I think in a certain way, it's made us better journalists, but it's not necessarily given journalists or journalism in India today a really the kind of image they had 30 years ago.
And we talk a lot about the sort of political interests and stuff, but of course there's corporate lobbying, and I wonder if people realize the extent to which you have propaganda if you don't have journalists questioning or pushing back or fact checking themselves. But it has become riskier and riskier for, I think, journalists globally as well. We keep seeing that, and of course in some of the areas that you cover in your reporting as well. So anyone who's listening to this or watching this later, we'd love to hear from you, especially aspiring journalists. If you have any questions, and I'm going to put them to Suhasini later and make the most of having this time with you. We're actually recording this a few days before the US election. So I want to ask you, when we switch focus a little bit and use your domain expertise here to talk us through. It's really sometimes when you follow the news cycles on social media, there's so much noise, right? There's so much going on. But sitting in India, what is your considered take on what happens next? What is it that is really at stake for a country like India, no matter who wins the elections in the US?
Well, certainly. And, the noise around this particular US election is so much more. I think also because of the unpredictable nature of the campaign itself. Firstly, I have to say that 4 years ago, when Donald Trump lost the elections in the US, most thought he'd be buried neck deep in cases so high that he would never be able to stand for election again. So it's certainly the first shocker is Donald Trump is not just back in the race, but that he is the Republicans' unanimous choice for candidate. Then, of course, we saw more recently the kind of excitement over whether Biden was fit to, whether the US President Joseph Biden was fit to be the Democratic candidate or not, given his health, given the kind of, sort of vagueness that was coming out in a lot of his speeches and a lot of disconnect that people were reporting. And that was then followed by the excitement of Kamala Harris being anointed, really, because they didn't go through another election at that point, anointed the Democrat Party contender. Just before that, we had, of course, this assassination attempt on Donald Trump. It's just been such an unprecedented election in so many ways, and it takes you away from what are the issues that are involved. Even it seems almost as if it's just about personalities right now. That you're either going to be, interested in someone like Trump, who promises to be everything he was the last time around, which is unpredictable. But this image that he's not from the sort of clique of Washington, and then you have Kamala Harris, who represents everything that Trump is not. She is, sort of has been a vice president for the last 4 years. So she, in a sense, is a legacy candidate, represents a lot of the policies of the current government, and has to, good for her or bad for her, take a responsibility for them. The issues for India now that you asked about, uh, at the start, I will say that from 1999, I think, when we are now 25 years from that date, and the end of the sanctions by the US against India for the nuclear test, we have actually seen an improvement of India US ties year upon year. There is no year where you can't say India US ties didn't take a great leap forward and and aren't better on a number of issues. And there's, of course, the nuclear deal was a big one. Every year there's something else that we've signed together that the two countries really are very, very proud of, and say have changed the paradigm, as it were, from any period of history before that 1999 period. I think there are some years when relations are go forward much faster. There are some years where there is a little bit of a lag, and I will say honestly, the 2024 has been a year of a little bit of a lag in that sense, particularly if you compare it with the previous year, and we can discuss the reasons for that. I think what India will be really looking for is whoever comes to the White House really wants to hit the floor running with the India relationship. With Trump, we know what his focus is going to be. It's going to be on the tariffs. It's going to be about trying to cut a trade deal. It's going to be about bringing down Indian non-tariff barriers as well, making ease of business a lot better. Those are the kind of issues that he's always criticized India for. But he's likely to give the Modi government and India a much easier time when it comes to some of the issues we've seen the Biden and Harris administration pick up in the last few years. The concerns about democracy in decline, the concerns about human rights violations, the concerns about minority rights, the farmers' protests, the Citizenship Amendment Act, and more recently, the concerns about what they call transnational repression, and the idea that Indian government agents are alleged to have been involved in a plot to kill a Khalistani activist in the US and, of course, in Canada as well. So those are some of the big noises that, if you like, have slowed down some of the momentum between India and the US in these years. If Kamala Harris were to come to power, obviously there would be a sense that she would carry forth some of those concerns, not so much with Trump. So that's baseline. What is the difference between them? But I think when it comes to technology, when it comes to defense ties, when it comes to strategic ties, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, when it comes to businesses working with each other and investing in each other's countries, both of them would really just take the trajectory forward between the two countries. So I don't think India is that worried. Final point would be, how would those two leaders deal with the other countries in South Asia?
Hmm.
And Trump, of course, it's all unpredictable. He woke up one day and the tweet he put out was that he would no longer be giving any assistance to Pakistan, um, and cancelled all assistance to Pakistan. And then maybe a few months later, we suddenly saw him invite the then Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan to the White House and say, actually, we're going to get together and solve Kashmir between us. And the Prime Minister of India has even asked me to mediate, which was then repudiated. But the point is, you have no idea what is going to come when it comes geopolitically from
Yeah.
Trump. I do think, apart from the neighborhood, and Bangladesh is another pointed case, but apart from the neighborhood, we'll be watching for the next president's attitude towards Ukraine in particular, because a Trump administration will necessarily, I mean, I think from all the pronouncements made, cut down a little bit of the support to Ukraine, perhaps, but also may also reopen ties with Russia. That would take some of the pressure off New Delhi.
Thank you, Suhasini. There's so many things I want to ask you about Ukraine, Russia, Canada. I'm going to encourage everyone to read your columns and watch Worldview to get your takes. But I do really think that sometimes when we're looking at these headlines, and this is completely as a layperson now, right? Like just from the outside, not reporting at all, not doing any journalism. It's hard to shake that feeling that the world is going to hell in a handbasket. I have to say, I mean, it feels like we're escalating constantly, right? I mean that these conflicts that earlier used to be contained have now spiraled and spilled over. And if we look at even Israel and Palestine, and I don't want to obviously ask you for a quick take, but I do want to ask you if you see nuance in India's position, because I think there are people on all sides of this who sometimes look at a country like India and then just wonder why we're voting the way, vetoing the votes in the UN. India's always had to do this balancing act, for example. And I just saw this, this tweet you had retweeted of that Randir Jaiswal had put out that, we're still supporting sending humanitarian aid to Palestine, acutely aware that this, war is spiraling out. I think it's been called a genocide at this stage. So comments from you on India's balancing act, and if you see that evolving in terms of foreign policy, and also if you want to address my going to hell in a handbasket general vibe that we seem to be getting.
Well, the hell in a handbasket is because we've had close to 100 years of, or at least 75 years of relative peace since the world wars. And obviously, it's not been peace. There have been all kinds of conflicts around the world, but it's not been at the World War level. So if your bar is at World War I and World War II, then everything below that. And so, therefore, it seems as if things are going badly. Someone said to me, Amrita, once, and he was a former head of state, actually. He said to me, when I was growing up, I was always taught that, men behaved like men, and he didn't mean it in a gender specific term, but men behave like men. They are emotional, they get angry, they want revenge, they have all these human emotions. But states always behave in a rational manner, which is for the best of their own countries as well as for all of humanity. And his point was that we're in a period now where states are behaving like men, where states are emotional and getting into slanging matches and looking for revenge for things and hitting out in a way which is not in the best interests of anyone, but having to do that in a certain sense. So I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of countries behaving very, very badly, to put it very mildly. And as a result, what we're seeing, whether it's the accusations of genocide in Gaza or whether it is the invasion of Ukraine, that has led to many questions about the entire international rule of law and the order. I think we're in uncharted territory. One of the reasons is because it's been 75 years, and the hold and the kind of commitments every country made to universal human rights, to non-aggression pacts and all the rest has kind of watered away a little, and everybody's looking once more towards their own interests. The second is this very tribal nature of foreign policy that seems to be emerging, which is that every country has to pick a side. It doesn't matter which side you pick, but you have to pick a side. And I think India, because of its non-alignment roots, because of the way strategic autonomy has been built as a concept here, stood up at the beginning of the Ukraine war and said, "Listen, we don't really want to pick a side. It's hurting us that there is a conflict. And can you please take a look at that too?" And there were enough other people who had the same idea. So you talk about the global South coming together, and India trying to channel that idea. When it comes to the Israel-Gaza situation, I think our position is a little more cloudy than it's ever been in the past. In the past, it had been very clear that India wanted good ties with Israel, and really bilateral ties are depend on so many areas of defense, of technologies that Israel shares with us, even for things like agriculture and water, as well as the kind of employment in both countries that we see. So Israel and India have always wanted to have better ties, certainly since they actually built full diplomatic relations in 1992. But India has always had its sympathy for the Palestinian cause. And I think that's where it's become a little cloudy, because right at the beginning, after October 7th, it seemed as if the Indian government would only see the fact that there'd been a terror attack. And that's what all the statements were about. Uh, and as a result, what you're talking about, the UN resolutions where India abstained, seems to be very surprising, because in the past India would never abstain on a resolution asking for Israel to cease fire, for example. Uh, then India pushed back and then shifted into a different kind of voting. But it's been back and forth for the last year. I think mainly because relations with Israel had become so much better, and relations with the US for that matter, that the government felt it needed to show some balance. Remember, Amrita, that when India is showing balance, it's essentially just abstaining from votes. It's not counting its vote as either side. And as you pointed out, continuing to send aid to Palestine. And I always point out that, look, there are nuances in this position. India has condemned the attacks of October 7th on Israel as a terror attack. And yet India has not designated Hamas as a terror organization, which is something the Israeli government has wanted India to do. India, has said Israel has a right to protect itself, and that it should be a reasonable kind of response. At the same time, India has increased its aid to UNRWA, the UN agency that
Yeah.
deals with refugees there, the aid agency there, which Israel believes is part of Hamas almost. Israel has called them all kinds of names. So, in a sense, India has kept certain traditional positions and is kind of hedging on the others, which is why you're quite right. It has been a confused position. It has not been a crystal clear, consistent position on any of those. But I think somewhere there, what you're seeing is also the debates within about how much is too much, how much should you say. What happens, for example, when Israeli soldiers are targeting UN troops in UNIFIL in Lebanon, and India has, close to 900 of its own troops there. The Indian government began by not really wanting to condemn Israel, but has ended up issuing very strong condemnations of the attacks on the UNIFIL soldiers. So, as I said, there is some amount of confusion. You're absolutely right, and we're trying to see, maybe it's a policy that's still in the works.
Okay. I wish I could ask you to look into your crystal ball and just tell us it's all going to be okay. I think we'll switch tacks a little bit now and ask you a little bit, taking off your professional suit of armor. There are no gotcha moments, remember, unless you spring one on me. But switching gears a little bit, I feel like sometimes when you're starting out your career, or you're even midway through your professional journey, you expect your career to go a certain way. I want to ask you, when you look back at the last 3 decades, and firstly, like, claps and kudos to you for 30 years as a journalist. You're definitely a reporter's reporter. And you've always, emphasized how important it is to do this job right. It is a vocation, it is a calling. And as you said, news is an essential service. How have you navigated the ups and downs, and is there anything you'd be comfortable sharing without putting any pressure on you there, but just in terms of when there are downs, when there are, we talk a lot about success and awards and accolades, and those are, very public for people to see, but what about when there are harder chapters or struggles? Is there anything you'd want to talk to us about, and how you navigated some of those challenges?
Well, firstly, the big part about this job is showing up. And that means sticking it out, continuing to be a journalist, continuing to be excited about being a journalist, getting up in the morning and saying, "So, what's my story today?" Even sometimes saying, "Oh my God, I didn't have a story yesterday," which means if I go today without a story, I'm out of a job. That sort of panic inside you. And I've lived with that panic all my life, let me tell you. I know that everyone looks at me and rolls their eyes. But the truth is that you're only as good as your last byline. And the more space between that byline and it can make people very nervous. Um, I certainly didn't. I fell into love with journalism practically on the first day. So I don't know what life would have been like if I was not a journalist. And the truth is, I wish for everyone. I say this to my kids too. I wish for everyone that they just find something that they enjoy, because in today's day there are such a plethora of different choices for so many people, that it would be a shame if you went through life and didn't find the one thing that does this for you. So even if you don't find it on the first attempt or the second or the third, you keep looking. So I was lucky that I fell into this as soon as practically was out of college. And it's been a I don't know where the years went. It's been 30 years. Uh, Possibly what has pushed my decisions a little bit, uh, which I did not expect. One, of course, was having kids, because this is a tough profession, and really, I have such admiration for all parents out there who are journalists, because this is a profession that will lose you all your friends. You don't know what time you're going to come home. You don't know if you're going to be able to make it to a dinner, even if it's a dinner you're hosting. By the way, that's happened to me too. And you have no real career path. You essentially don't do something very differently. I mean, I frankly think of my life as not that different from when I started out. You're still chasing people, you're still trying to get that one interview that nobody else has gotten yet, and then really worrying about the scoop that you missed and somebody else got. So that doesn't change that much, and you're so wrapped up in the rest of the world that it's not always the easiest to spend time really focusing on your family. So I do think that some of my decisions may have been made because I had kids, um, and you've met them, so you know that it's always a little bit of a
Yeah.
scramble. Whether you're going to get to school on time, for a parents' day, or you're just going to have to go ahead and record your show at that exact time.
But
Uh,
having said, and then having met them at a young age, but having said that, I do remember other editors saying that you were always amazing at juggling everything. So I know you've said in the past that it just looks like that from the outside, but
yeah.
hats off
No,
for managing to.
nobody's amazing at juggling anything, because something will always give. I'm sure
Yeah,
kids have a different story to tell, but I think what's important is to enjoy what you're doing, because then it makes it worth it, and it makes it worth
yeah,
it to your family as well, to your spouse
yeah,
and to your children. That if you are really happy in what you're doing, it'll make it worth it for anyone who loves you.
yeah,
I think that may have decided my career path in a small amount of way. I think the other thing was a bomb blast I got into, and for no other reason but that it changed how I could physically do things. And to begin with, it wasn't something that. Essentially, this was in Srinagar in the year 2000, and it was an injury from a fairly big bomb blast where a lot of people died. I think more than 20 people died in that blast. I happened to be injured at the time, but I didn't realize perhaps how much the injury was. So about 5 years later, I had to go through surgery. And that kind of became a change in my life, when I decided that I should take back from some of the uncertainties of my life. It's not okay to constantly be like, okay, I remember when the tsunami happened in 2004, leaving the house, telling the kids, I'll be back for lunch. And yes, I was back for lunch, like I think 10 days or 2 weeks later. And you don't get that chance again to tell them, listen, it's okay, I'm not going to disappear all the time.
Yeah.
And that contributed also to what had happened. I had to have my surgery to my arm at the time. And that's when I met you, and we worked together at CNN IBN, and I was doing a lot more in the studio than I was in the field, compared to. So the first 10 years of my life, I was with CNN International, my professional life. I was with CNN International. We were in those days called the South Asia Bureau, so we covered everything in South Asia, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Those were exciting years. Assassinations were happening, hijackings were happening, floods were happening, tsunamis were happening. You name it, every kind of calamity in the world was going on in South Asia. And we were traveling continuously to try and keep up with them. So the next 10 years, I was a little more in the studio, although you will remember that, I ended up going to Lebanon during the
Yeah,
war.
yeah. I was just
I was
gonna
in
say, yeah,
Libya, went to
yeah,
Syria, did some exciting things, and all the neighborhood as well, Pakistan,
yeah,
Benazir Bhutto's assassinations and stuff. Um, and then in 2014, I got to a point where I said, the sheer physicality of television is becoming a little difficult to deal with. Some of it was, actually physical, feeling that I couldn't take it. And, I think journalists have to realize that there has to be a point where you say, okay, maybe there's someone younger, as we say, younger, thinner, fitter, willing to work for less,
yeah, yeah.
who
Especially that last,
who
especially
will,
that
who
last
will probably do the job better than you would at a certain stage. And so I decided, and I got an offer from the Hindu to work for them, and I decided consciously to move out of television and into print. I always joke
one.
that everybody else, looks at a career path that involves making more money. I've actually taken a pay cut with every new job I took.
With every
Luckily,
okay,
there
anyone
have
listening?
only been three jobs in my life, or I would be earning zero right now. But yeah, and I moved to a newspaper. The idea was that you'd get a little more time to think. You'd have to do a little
Hmm.
less physical activity. Carry the tripod, always
Hmm.
be physically present at a certain place to do a live shot or be in the studio. And that's been 10 years now. So I would say expect the unexpected in any journalism career. And it's
Yeah.
those unexpected moments that perhaps decided my career a little more.
I love that. Every time I talk to you, I miss journalism so much. And I remember that I always thought I was taking a sabbatical. So you never know. It's like it's been a 10-year sabbatical and I've
It's
moved into another.
it's in your blood.
It's
Once
yeah.
once you've been a journalist, I don't think you ever stop really being a journalist.
Which I think is it's wonderful and actually does help you connect with people and stories, the rest of your life. But when you said it gives you time to think, it just reminded me that I think I only got a chance to sit, breathe, and read a newspaper, three newspapers after quitting. That especially those breakfast shows, and I don't know what kind of hours we used to pull. But just again, mindful of time. So two more questions with for you right now, Suhasini, and hopefully we'll come back to you next year and do this in person. But you've always been a big reader. You've always been someone who doesn't just give a quick take. You think through, and of course that's professionally important for you. But I feel like even in person, even in your personal life, is there anything you're reading, watching, listening to you right now that you'd like to recommend or that you want to read? Anything you'd like to share?
Well, I mean, I am I am naturally a very very addicted reader. I got into the profession simply because I thought if I'm reading five newspapers at the age of 18, I must really enjoy this and no other reason. And I still, Amit, I still tell young people who come up to me and say, I really want to go into the profession, and then and then you find out they want to be in TV, and then they say, and I say, so what do you want to do in television? And they'll say, I want to read the news. And I'm always like looking at them and going, yes, yes, you must read the news, you must read five newspapers, you must get on a website, you must. share your subscriptions if you need to, but always be on top of what's going on. And then you realize after a while, no, what they want is to read the news off a teleprompter. And I always say to them, spend your time in the field as much as you can, because once you go into a studio, you have to be more considered. You're actually learning less. You're
Mm.
having to spend so much more time telling people about what's going on. But I still think that the answer to anything is to read. Unfortunately, I don't read as much as I should of other stuff anymore. Those of your viewers who watch Worldview or listen to the Worldview podcast would know that at the end of every episode, I put out a list of books that I think are useful for the subject that we're talking about. So I put out about 5 or 6 books a week, and mostly are books I have read. When I haven't read them, I say it. So pretty much what I'm reading. I'll tell you a book I just finished, which I'm amazed, has been finished literally like 2 weeks before the American elections. It's called War by Bob Woodward. And I, it tells you about how the Biden years dealt with the wars, but it also tells you about Trump. It also tells you about Kamala Harris, and as you know, with a Woodward book, uh,
Mm.
um, essentially what you're doing is you're getting an in into the most exclusive, rarefied zones of Washington and what they're talking about. There's one point where Woodward recounts a conversation, I kid you not, between the U.S. Secretary of State Blinken taking Joe Biden out for lunch. And he's actually got the conversation between the two of them. So you have
Wow.
to wonder, like, how good are your sources? And it's not been denied. So I presume that
Yeah.
all of it's true. So that's
Yeah.
a book I've been reading. I'm looking forward to a whole bunch of books coming out. Amrita, I have to be honest though, I used to be an inveterate reader of fiction, and all my
Mm.
friends read fiction because it's such it opens up a whole new world. And I consciously decided about 20 years ago to not read fiction until I retire, because I just was not able
Wow.
to find the time to do it. And I said, if I start reading fiction, it will not stop until I have finished that book. It's like what people feel now with Netflix and OTT, and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
you need to binge watch. So I said I will only read nonfiction while I'm still in the profession, because otherwise I will miss out on so many books that I need for my profession that it won't work. So I'm really looking forward to one day just sitting down with only fiction, and I'll wait for you
Well,
to give me recommendations on those.
I have a novel coming out after 7 years in December, so I'm gonna park that for you for when you retire in how many
Yeah,
ever years that
well,
is.
I have
Not
read
soon enough.
every book that you have written, Amrita. You
Aw.
should know
Well,
that.
thank you so much, Suhasini. Okay,
Starting
well,
with breaking news.
yes, which you helped me, launch into this world. And we've had several chats. Suhasini, sorry, last thing for you is, and I'm really grateful for your time. Firstly, before
No,
I
not
pop
at
this to you,
all.
is when we talk about gratitude, without getting corny, but sometimes it is nice to wind down with things we're grateful for, especially as life gets more and more complicated and social media makes us all angry with each other. What are a few things you're grateful for at this point?
I'm just grateful for honestly everything. I think nothing comes easily for anyone. So it's not as if I feel everything just fell in my lap and so it's so wonderful. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to see the world as much as I have, and to have been able to open as many windows as I feel I have
Hmm.
in that time for people to look into different ideas, different stories, different ways people live around the world. And of course, one is grateful for one's family because, as I said, left to yourself as a journalist, you would have nobody who likes you. Forget loving you, actually liking you, when you can never be counted on to show up, when you
Oh,
cancel appointments at the last minute, when I mean, I used to say, your friends by the people who will not say a word when you call them and say, listen, I'm not going to make it for your dinner until past midnight, and they just say, we'll reheat the food for you. That's when you know that they're not even questioning the idea that you
yeah,
might have to get on a flight and leave. And so in that, one has to be grateful for one's friends. One has to be grateful for
yeah.
all the great friends one makes along the way, because I think the some of the excitement of being a journalist is that you share it with so many other great journalists, and you meet so many other people who are as passionate as you are. I
Yeah.
remember, I think it was Marie Colvin or one of these real journalism greats who said to me once that if our bosses knew how much fun we had, they'd stop paying us. And I'm sorry, maybe I shouldn't say this right now,
Don't give them ideas.
but 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 essentially
Yeah.
that's something to be really grateful for, I
Yeah.
mean,
It really
all
is a
the
tribe, right? Wherever you
yeah,
go in the world,
it
you'll
is.
find.
Absolutely, and you're exactly the same. You have the same kind of
Yeah.
issues and worries and things about the world, and I do think that what we need to look out for, and this is just a note to self more than note to other journalists, is try not to take yourself too seriously in all of this. Try not to become part of your story. uh, Once you have reported a story, that story is for your reader, your viewer, your listener. It doesn't belong to you in that sense. And the idea that that these big things are happening in the world, they would happen in the world even if you weren't around to report them. So you have to remember what your role in all of this is very much, and not become part of the scenery in a sense. It's easy to see this as a very glamorous profession, um, because like very glamorous professions, you have a studio and you have a makeup artist and you have a wardrobe manager if you're lucky. But at the end of the day, the truth is we're none of those things. The idea of a journalist is that person who's going and getting a story, which perhaps otherwise would not get reported.
Yeah.
And it's so important not to take yourself too seriously about that.
I love that. I think that's a really good note for us to end on. We'll pause this conversation because I'm going to pick it up hopefully
Always.
next year, as I said. And Suhasini, more power to your pen. Thank you so much for what you do and for the passion you bring to your journalism and all the good sense you put out into the world. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Amrita, I'm not going to let you go without also making a point of saying thank you to you for what you do, what you have built over the last few years when it comes to people living with mental health conditions, people I know who have benefited from the kind of light you shine. I think you should know that it is very important, that it's not just we can't take these things for granted, particularly in the worlds we live in now. And it is so important to have a community that is able to talk about these issues and to share the kind of experiences they have. And you've built that community, so really kudos to you.
Oh, thank you so much, and for the validation right when we started reporting on mental health back in the day, at our former channel. Thank you so much, Swasni. I appreciate that. Thank you. Talk to you soon, hopefully.
See you. Bye.